Happy St Catherine's Day to all. It was on the feast of St Catharine in the 13th year of King Edward IV in 1473 that a tiny academic establishment opened its doors not far from where we are now. And I've been asked to say a few words about that event. It wasn't the sort of event that got its way into chronicles, and the sources are mostly in our own muniment room. But I'll piece together what we know of the story and ponder upon a few unsolved mysteries. The founder, of course, was Dr. Robert Woodlark, a provost of King's College, and the best place to start is Woodlark's own account of what he did. His Memoriale Nigrum, so called, I suppose, because it once had a black cover. St Catharine Hall of Cambridge, spelt as on the slide, was built, he said, at his own costs and expenses on 5 plots of land in Mill Street, which is now Queen's Lane, because it led to the mill, for a master and certain fellows, suitably vague at that point, to remain forever to the glory of God and the affirmation of the faith, which work was consummated et ad perfectum deventum on the feast of St Catharine 1473. That's the extract from it there, you can see. He went on to say, as you see the bottom half of the slide, that on the morrow, Master Peter Weld and Dominus John Wardle entered Commons as fellows, together with Master James Wilbord and Edmund Bacton as commensales, commoners. Those names are worth a little bit of investigation to begin with. The first named fellow, Weld, is described in the register with a slight change of spelling, which is the first name on that list, as Natione Picardus, which means by birth a Picard. But the name doesn't look French. Picardy at that time included part of Flanders, and indeed the Picard nation at Paris University was mostly Flemish. And I would suggest that the name is actually Velde, and he's surely the Peter van der Velde who became rector of Cottenham in 1474, the following year. Wardle, who came from Lincolnshire, was presumably only a BA, assuming that Dominus was a deliberate contrast with Magister. When I became a fellow, BAs were still entered on the college lists with DNS against their name for Dominus. I think we stopped doing that some years ago, but that's still within living memory. Wardle would become master of the college in 1487, and he left all his books to be divided among the senior members of the college. James Wilbord, though described as Magister, according to Emden's Biographical Dictionary, didn't take his MA till 1477. I can't explain that. Little is known about him, save that he was Natione Scotus, a Scotsman. Edmund Bacton later took a doctorate in divinity and in 1494 became rector of Kelling in Norfolk. And I suppose that they were perhaps admitted initially as commoners because they were not yet in priests' orders, but they became fellows very soon afterwards. Woodlark's memorandum ends with a draft petition to erect this foundation as a college for a master and 10 fellows studying philosophy and theology. However, in the Royal Charter of 1475, to which I will return, the ambitions were scaled down more realistically to 3 or more. Bishop Browne, in his History of the College, thought this draft petition might have dated from the 1450s when Woodlark had his first thoughts. But if so, it's rather strange that he copied it out in 1473 in his Memoriale. As for the site, the memorandum, as I mentioned, refers to 5 tenements which he purchased, and we still have all the title deeds in the muniment room, going right back to the time of Edward I. There's just some of them there. They can all be untangled and deciphered. He began acquiring the land in 1459 when he bought 2 tenements on Mill Street in the parishes of St Edward and St Botolph, facing the Carmelite friary. As you know, the parish boundary mark is still painted over D staircase, which I suppose is the line between those 2 tenements. The Whitefriars was acquired by Queen's after the dissolution, and that enabled them to move across the road, and they didn't have to build on what is now the Master's Lodge site, which belonged to Queen's until relatively recently. To these 2 plots, Woodlark soon added the adjoining properties on either side, one of them belonging to Michael House. That nice Vesica-shaped seal at the top of that bundle is the Michael House seal. It's got an angel trampling on a dragon, holding a shield with a cross. Looks awfully like St George, but it's actually St Michael. Woodlark also bought lands around Cambridge, dozens and dozens of little strips of fields, in order to produce some income for his foundation and to provide timber and stone for the building. These deeds give all the abuttals and dimensions, but several people, including me, have tried to piece together exactly what that plot amounted to, and we've not managed to map them exactly against the present configuration of the college. But at any rate, the original buildings were located in the northwest quarter of the present main court, that is the quarter opposite the hall entrance, extending to the backyard of the Bull, the Black Bull Inn on this side, which incidentally is first mentioned by that name in 1477. And evidently, Woodlark rebuilt these buildings because there was previously a brew house and a tannery on 2 of the tenements which he bought. We don't have any plan of the layout, but it seems from older references that the hall must have been more or less where the SCR now is, with a library and a principal chamber for the master above it. The statutes of 2 years later also mention a tower or treasury where the statutes, the register, other muniments, and the common seal were to be kept. Very sensible archival policy to put the archives above ground. The chapel, which was not completed until the later 1470s, is said to have been on the opposite side, which would have put it somewhere in the middle of the main court. We know that it contained an image of St Catharine in the window, destroyed by the infamous smasher dowsing on the 28th of December 1643, together with another one depicting St George and the dragon. By a curious coincidence, both saints were removed from the Roman calendar on the same day in 1969. Though I believe Catherine was put back in 2002. I'm not an expert on saints, but I read that somewhere. Bishop Brown recorded that during a drought in the 1880s, it was possible to see the buttresses in the dry grass in the main court. But recent droughts have not yielded similar results, I'm afraid. This bird's eye view of 1592, was a unique engraving in the Bodleian Library, is the nearest we have to a picture of the old college. It's got Mill Street or Queen's Lane at the top of this one. And so the larger court that you see, the smaller court, just under the word Catherine's, is, I think, the original court of the old college, near enough. Although it seems to have a wall facing the street rather than buildings. But there's another slightly earlier engraving here. This is the other way up, I'm afraid, with Mill Street at the bottom. And this doesn't in any way collate with the other one. And I think that's proof enough that these are actually wholly imaginary. The cartographers didn't pay any attention to what happened inside the walls. I don't think they stepped inside. And so they just made up what the buildings might have been. It may be that archaeological excavation in the main court might tell us whether the chapel lies buried there, but recent sonar surveys have not been very encouraging. Some brick foundations were found under the paving near the SCR in the 1960s, but they weren't properly surveyed. We just have a few biro scribbles by Dr. Aston. And that's all we know about the original buildings, save that they were very modest. The infant college was the smallest in Cambridge and couldn't have housed more than a handful of fellows and commoners. 6 might well have been the physical limit. The buildings lasted only 200 years, and the inscription beneath Logan's engraving of the 1670s says that their ruins were more unsightly than any in Cambridge. The old hall was pulled down in 1673, and the bicentenary was celebrated by building a sturdy new one in brick. Not exactly a work of restoration exuberance, but it must have replaced something pretty decrepit. Our next piece of hard evidence is the charter. The draft petition, which I mentioned earlier, sought pontifical authority for the foundation. But I don't think this necessarily meant the Pope, as Bishop Brown assumed. Every bishop was a pontifex, and the surviving license for worship in the chapel was granted in January 1476 by the Bishop of Ely by his pontifical authority. There it is, or a copy of it. There's nothing relating to Catharine Hall in the calendar of papal registers relating to Great Britain and Ireland, which I checked. There was a papal confirmation in 1445 of a petition by Henry VI concerning King's College, though it wasn't necessary for the purposes of English law. The king was quite capable of creating a corporation by patent. The only privilege in the papal confirmation for kings beyond that conferred by the Royal Charter was that the king could assign a special habit to be worn by the provost and scholars at divine offices. I don't know whether the king ever did so, and I'm not sure he really needed papal authority to do it either. Anyway, Woodlark obtained the Royal Charter for Catharine Hall on the 16th of August, 1475, sealed with the Great Seal of Edward IV, on red and blue laces, the Yorkist livery colours, and witnessed by little Edward, Prince of Wales. There's the witnessing clause. You see the second word of the last line, Eduardo, primogenito nostro principe valiae. He was only 4 at the time, so being keeper of the realm was quite a task for a little lad of that age. And it was he, of course, who achieved an unhappy fame as one of the so-called princes in the Tower. He was actually King of England by then, in 1483. And some of you have seen a television programme last week which suggested that he survived and was crowned in Dublin in 1487. And according to contemporary propaganda, that person was an impostor called Lambert Simnel. But that could be another lecture. The hall was incorporated as a master and 3 or more fellows to be called in perpetuity Aula Sanctae Catharinae Virginis. Woodlark called it in English St Catharine Hall. The charter is still operative as our birth certificate, and it also says that the hall was to be a collegium societatem sive comitiva, a college, fellowship, or company. So the term hall didn't import anything less than a college. King's Hall at that time was a very important college, one of the biggest, and Clare and Pembroke were also called halls. Only Trinity Hall has retained that name for obvious reasons. We gave it up in the Victorian period, though we are still, for legal purposes, the college or hall of St Catharine the Virgin. Soon after the charter was sealed, we know that because it says Licentia Regia, so I've slipped into lawyer's pronunciation, ad id obtentar, Woodlark laid down the first statutes in Latin, couched in the first person, because it was the privilege of a founder to lay down the statutes for a corporation. As in the charter, there were to be 3 or more fellows. One of these was to be president, appointed by the master. They were all to reside within 4 miles, but could go on journeys with permission. At dinner, they were to listen to a reading from the Bible, the Fathers or the Doctors, which were to be read Morae Ecclesiasticae Lectionis by a boy or clerk called the Biblista, Bible clerk. That was a position later endowed by Lady Bernardiston, and the incumbent was known as Lady Bernardiston's child. This reading was to be listened to without talking, shouting, laughing, grumbling, or tumult of any kind. It was quite a noisy little bunch of half a dozen fellows to have these warnings. If fellows wished to converse in hall, they were to do so in Latin, unless the master or president allowed otherwise. There are provisions about the library, which was to be audited every year. Some of the books were chained, while those which were not chained could be borrowed. None were ever to be sold or pledged. There are none left. Don't know what happened to them. The statutes then set out Woodlark's general objects more specifically than the Charter did. Firstly, the praise, glory, and honour of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, and St Catharine the Virgin. Next, the exaltation of the Christian faith. Thirdly, the defence and advancement of Holy Church through the dissemination and administration of God's Word. And fourthly, augmentum scientiarum et facultatum philosophiae et sacrae theologiae. Now that last phrase, which I left in Latin, might seem ambiguous, because you could read it as meaning the augmentation of the sciences and of the faculties of philosophy and theology. But obviously that isn't what it meant. It must have meant the augmentation of the sciences and faculties of philosophy and theology, as in the draft petition for incorporation. Indeed, as set out further in the statutes, fellows were to be sworn to do their utmost to dissuade the other fellows from turning to any science or faculty other than philosophy or theology. Science, as we understand it, would not have been known by that name, and it almost certainly wouldn't have been thought consistent with theology, which was based on revelation and doctrine rather than experiment and rational deduction. In any case, there were no degrees in science, as we know it, apart from medicine. Philosophy, I think, just meant the degree of Master of Arts. So the prohibition must have been aimed at lawyers. Woodlark doubtless thought there were far too many of them in King's. Though I hasten to point out, declaring an obvious interest, that academic lawyers in those days were canonists. The common law of England wasn't taught at either university until the Georgian period. In fact, some of our early benefactors were canonists, and the very next fellow admitted after the morrow of St Catharine in 1473 was John Cock, a Bachelor of Law, who became rector of Bottisham. So it wasn't absolutely beyond the pale to look at law books, but it just wasn't part of the college's original mission to waste time on human law. And of the huge library of 137 books given by Woodlark, not one concerned canon law. Woodlark obviously couldn't have foreseen that law and science would both eventually be brought within the arts curriculum and philosophy in his sense. The most detailed of the statutes concerned commemorative prayers. Without going into minute detail, which would take probably the rest of the time, I'll try to convey the general gist. Whenever the Master and Fellows said the Lord's Prayer after Mass, they were to pray that the soul of the founder and all faithful departed rest in peace. And the same words of requiem were to be spoken whenever grace was said at dinner or supper. Dinner being lunch, of course. Every week forever there was to be a Mass on Saturday for the Virgin Mary and on Sunday for St Catharine, cum nota, that is sung, I presume, with a special collect for the founder and his family. And on the anniversary of Woodlark's death, nobody knows when that was, they didn't seem to have written it down, and at 4 other times of the year, there was to be a said requiem with the same special collect. And there's an interesting clause concerning other persons who were to be especially commended, a wish which we have honoured to this day and will do so this evening. Those he mentioned were first King Henry VI, and since Woodlark claimed not to have used any of the king's money, this presumably refers to him as Woodlark's personal benefactor. Next, Richard and Joan Woodlark, his father and mother, obviously personal benefactors. Then he adds Lady Elizabeth de Burgh, Thomas Quondam Lord Lawar, and the benefactors of the same hall, together with Master William Cott and Master Clement Denston. There it is. You see Elizabeth de Burgo in the first line. Now, not much attention has been paid to this clause in the past. Grammatically, none of the four named persons are actually included among the benefactors, because he says Burgh, Lawar, and the benefactors, together with Clot and Denston, not actually specifying any benefactors as such. But who were these people? The only Lady Elizabeth de Burgh to whom this can possibly refer died in 1327. She was also Countess of Clare and is best known as the foundress of Clare Hall, now Clare College. That's a picture of her on her seal, of which a rather interesting carving has recently been unveiled in Clare. It's worth going to see, but it's based on this seal. We can only speculate that perhaps Woodlark began his Cambridge career at Clare Hall, my best guess. The only Thomas Quondam Lord Lawar must be the 5th Baron, that's his seal, don't have a picture of him, who died as long ago as 1426. He was ordained as a priest and became rector of Manchester, a little village up in Cheshire. Bishop Brown discovered that his will was dated at Wakerley in Northamptonshire, which was Woodlark's birthplace, and so presumably there's some childhood connection here, which explains his mention. So they're not benefactors. The other two are perhaps more easily explained. A Clement Denston, Bachelor of Divinity from Cambridge, was a residentiary canon of St Paul's, Archdeacon of Sudbury, and Treasurer of the household of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. He died in 1452, which is a bit early, but I can't trace a later namesake. Maybe there was one who died in the 1470s, which would make more sense, but nobody's found him. William Cott, LLB Cantab, was also connected with Suffolk. He was rector of Long Melford, also of Barningham and Farnham All Saints, and he was benefactor to a Yorkist guild of brothers and sisters in Bury St Edmunds, where his soul was prayed for. And we have his will, which was made in 1473 and proved in 1475. And we know that Woodlark procured benefactions from the executors of both Cott and Denston to complete the library and chapel, because in June of 1475, Woodlark and the Fellows agreed in writing to say prayers in perpetuity, not only for Cott and Denston, but also in future for their executors once the college was given notice of their dates of death. That's the composition for William Cott and Clement Denston. As you'll see from the note at the foot, if you can read it, they were given a joint exequy on the Friday after Dominica in Albis, the first Sunday after Easter. As an afterthought, at the end of the statutes, Woodlark made provision for a chantry priest to pray for the soul of the principal benefactress, Lady Joan Barnardiston, who gave 100 marks towards the first building on condition that a fellow be appointed to sing for her soul in perpetuity. That's a piece of the statutes there. It's broken in two because it's on 2 pages. 100 marks doesn't convert into decimal money, of course. It's £66.66 recurring. That's about £68,000 in today's money, according to the Bank of England inflation calculator, which wouldn't build much today, but it would have gone a long way in 1473. It's odd that Woodlark didn't think of mentioning her when he made his list earlier, because she obviously was a major benefactor. But possibly she gave the money in 1475 while he was drafting the statutes to continue building what was already underway. The Bernardiston widows became regular benefactresses. Joan's daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, emulated her example by giving 100 marks in 1515, and her scholarships are still awarded every year. And Lady Catharine, the widow of her great-great-grandson in the time of Charles I, gave £400. So this was another East Anglian family, but the exact connection between Woodlark and Suffolk remains to be uncovered. Maybe it was just a rich pasture for fundraisers to graze in. One of the statutes provides that the fellows should be English. So one can only wonder what the two non-English foundation fellows, Peter van der Velde and James Wilbord, had done to earn Woodlark's disapproval. As an aside, I can recall that when I became a fellow, there were only 3 fellows who were not English, one from New Zealand, and the other 2, like James Wilbord, were Scottish, one of whom is here. Actually, slightly later than when I became a fellow. On the subject of the statutes, I can throw in another aside. Woodlark didn't appoint a visitor. According to the common law, in the absence of such an appointment, the visitorship of an eleemosynary foundation devolves on the heirs of the founder. That was settled in a chancery case concerning this college in 1791. Now, Woodlark, as an unmarried cleric, obviously had no lineal heirs, and there seem to have been no Woodlarks in England for a long time. There were no Woodlarks in the 1921 census, for instance. Woodlark's sister Isabel had children by her husband William Bryan of Swineshead. However, the Court of Chancery found that Woodlark's heirs were extinct and that therefore the visitorship devolved on the Crown. And the court decreed that it should be exercised through the Lord Chancellor personally and not through the Court of Chancery. And there it remains, despite Mr. Blair's attempt to abolish the office. And so our recent visitors have included such luminaries as Liz Truss and Dominic Raab. Well, so much for the surviving evidence. And now for some speculations about the foundation. Woodlark himself, like the bird, is difficult to track down. According to the website of the Wildlife Trusts, the secretive woodlark can be hard to spot. And this translates into history as well. Our register says he was born in Northamptonshire, leaving a blank for the place, but later sources supply the name as Wakerley, as I mentioned, a village which happens to be in the Welland Valley, appropriately enough, 8 miles from Stamford in one direction and 8 miles from Uppingham in the other direction. I've tried in vain to find any historical records of his family, which, as I say, became extinct centuries ago. His personal seal has a woodlark taking flight. That's his seal on the left, and the original college seal on the right. This suggests that he was not armigerous. The supposed woodlark arms, impaling the Catharine wheel, as you see in the middle there, were not used by Woodlark himself, as Bishop Browne supposed, but were concocted in 1615 by a Cambridge arms painter when he produced a hand-painted souvenir booklet on the occasion of James I's visit. That's where this illustration comes from, one of the many copies of it. The leopard of England and the lion of France obviously allude to the arms of kings, or the royal arms. Bishop Browne campaigned for their reintroduction, and they were used for 30 years or so until the 1920s. There are 2 plaques from my collection, and there is a match holder and a tobacco jar, and there are various other bits and pieces on which you could find Woodlark's arms at one time. And there they are in the OCR. And you can also see them on the recent lampposts in the main court, though they still haven't been gilded. We don't know what Woodlark looks like. The portrait in Hall was commissioned from a local painter in 1773, obviously for the tercentenary. He based it on a mezzotint of 1714 by John Faber, who produced pictures of all the founders of Cambridge colleges, and if there weren't any pictures, he made them up. And the painter turned it into a 3/4 length in MA dress for some reason. Professor Hutton, who wrote the printed catalogue of the college's pictures, acknowledged that the painting wasn't coeval with the founder, but he convinced himself that it was based on a contemporary likeness, and he even had it x-rayed in 1944 in the hope of finding an earlier version underneath, which he speculated might have been transferred from panel. It was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And he went on to speculate that because it was so difficult, it probably didn't transfer very well, and therefore they painted over a lot of it. That accounted for some of the anachronisms. But that's carrying romantic fantasy a bit too far. There's no painting underneath, and no reason to think that it was copied from an earlier painting on panel. As a 15th century cleric, Woodlark would not have had a beard. He would have been shown in his scarlet DD robes or in clerical dress. He would have been shown in a doctor's cap or a tonsure, and the composition would have been entirely different. In fact, it looks like an Elizabethan or Jacobean head on an 18th century body, and that's exactly what it is. Almost certainly this is the original of Faber's engraving. It's an engraving of John Reynolds, an Oxford divine who contributed to the King James translation of the Bible and died in 1607. He was president of Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and I've seen the original painting of that in the president's study there. And as you see, the composition is exactly the same. They alter the face a bit, but it's clearly the same picture. The painter of 1773 is mentioned in our audit books, which Hutton didn't look at. And it's obvious that what he did, he just took the mezzotint and enlarged it up to 3/4 length, leaving out the book. Presumably nobody told him that Woodlark was a doctor of divinity. Woodlark's death is as obscure as his origins, though a contemporary master of corpus wrote that in his last years, through illness, he was not of whole mind. And he seems not to have been buried in King's, so perhaps he lies under the old chapel here, wherever that was, or in the parish where he died, wherever that was. The college register describes him as benign, mild, and humble. You see it, benignus, mansuetus et humilis, which is the only description of him we have. But he obviously had drive and a knack in tugging the purse strings of potential benefactors. His foundation of St Catharine's is one of the greatest enigmas in the history of English education. Why would the head of the largest college in Cambridge, who also had responsibilities for the reform of the next largest, King's Hall, and was simultaneously Chancellor of the University, set out to establish a new college of relatively minuscule proportions? The foundation of a college by the head of another was in itself unique in Cambridge or Oxford. The most obvious, though not the whole answer, is that it was a chantry. the importance attached to the prayers for Woodlark's soul is obvious from the statutes which I've mentioned. Purgatory was the most brilliant fundraising device ever invented. You scare the hell into people, and then you offer them protection if they give you lots of money. And the bigger the premium, the stronger the insurance. Remarkably, it worked as fundraising. I'm not sure whether it helped people hereafter, but it brought in the money. Such was the respect for crackpot academic theories in those days. So if you only had modest means, you endowed a few prayers for your soul. If you were wealthy, you founded a college where you would be prayed for every day forever. If you were Margaret Beaufort, you played safe and founded 2 colleges. But that's only a partial explanation for Woodlark's curious enterprise. Emden pointed out that he could have got more prayers for his money by endowing chantries in different institutions. A king's would have been an obvious starting point. However, even this presupposes that Woodlark had lots of money to spend. How did a poor academic from a humble background, even if he was a doctor of divinity and a head of house, manage to become wealthy by honest means? He could hardly have asked donors to give him money to look after his own soul. On the other hand, if you were clever and personable and well-placed, you were in a position to persuade other people to help you found a college with high ideals where prayers would be said in eternity for all of you. It's only a suggestion, but that might be it. There's no direct evidence that Woodlark was raising money from benefactors from 1459 onwards to buy the tenements in Mill Lane. So where the initial funds came from is a matter of guesswork. There was certainly a suspicion around 1473 that Woodlark had diverted some of the development income from kings. He went to some lengths to deny this in his memorial on the foundation, claiming that kings actually owed him money and that he didn't use as much as a farthing for Catharine Hall. And Dr. Emden went through the king's building accounts to see if he could find any discrepancies, but he couldn't. But Woodlark's own account records that the stream of royal money for kings dried up as a result of what he called the malitia nova, meaning the civil war and the deposition of Henry VI. And thereafter it was a matter of finding private donors. It wasn't a very successful campaign. King's Chapel, which was doubtless seen as a Lancastrian monument, stood unfinished until Henry VIII's time, just when Catharine Hall was rising up next door. And it's easy to speculate that even if all the finances were above board, the fundraising approaches might have been a little fluid during that period. Could it even be that Woodlark regarded Henry VI's foundation as an unstable project in the current state of things? At his request, we will remember King Henry VI this evening, not Edward IV. But Woodlark's project for Catharine Hall began after Henry VI had lost control of the kingdom, his first purchase being made 3 days before the defeat of the king's forces at Blore Heath. And between then and 1473, King Henry was captured 3 times and eventually in 1471 murdered in the Tower of London. So there may be a political dimension to this. I just raise it, can't answer it. Another obvious question is this: why did this celibate cleric choose to dedicate his college to a brilliant and beautiful young woman, so we're told she was, who made her name by defeating in theological argument the Egyptian counterparts of the Cambridge Doctors of Divinity? I have a little picture of her. That's from the miniature from the Tarleton Hours, which was given to the college. Hung in my rooms for many years. According to the earliest version of her story, she converted 50 Islamic scholars to Christianity, whereupon they were all burned to death. The Virgin Mary, also remembered in the foundation, was revered as a stay-at-home mother. Catherine, on the other hand, was the nearest equivalent to a female Don. It's obvious why women were not included in Woodlark's foundation, because that would have been astonishing, impossible even. The college was a seminary for clergy originally, and women were not allowed to be clergy. So why dedicate a college to an unthinkable ideal? A possible reading of the foundation story is that the college was so named simply because 25th of November happened to be the date on which the builders finally handed over the site. But that doesn't ring true. Woodlark himself said he had a special devotion to St Catharine. Could he have been born on the 25th of November? Or was it connected with the cult of Henry VI? Figures of St Catharine and St Margaret, that's St Catharine, as you can just see the wheel on the right, little white dots on the wheel, and a sword in her right hand. These figures were carved on label stops in King's College while Woodlark was in charge of the building. And it has been suggested that they refer to Catherine of Valois and Margaret of Anjou, the mother and queen of his patron. Henry VI had shown special favour to St Catharine's Hospital by the Tower of London by granting it a new charter in 1442. And the hospital was a very popular pilgrimage destination, as evidenced by numerous pewter pilgrim badges of Catherine wheels and occasionally figures. That one's in the British Museum. Other dedications to her were ubiquitous. There was even another St Catharine's in Cambridge. St Catharine's Hostel in St Michael's Lane still existed as a grammar school for a few decades after 1473, though it was later swallowed up in Trinity College. There was no specific link between the hostel and Woodlark's Hall, but it's obvious that the link between the saint and true learning was so strong that it would allow for two dedications in the same university town. Catherine had been a patron saint of scholars, at least since the 13th century, when Balliol College, Oxford, was dedicated to her. That's the 1588 seal of Balliol College. And there's no picture of Balliol, the picture is of St Catharine. The Fellows of Balliol will be celebrating this evening their principal feast. And it's not often noticed that Oxford now has two St Catharine's colleges, because that's what Balliol is. For Woodlark, leaving aside her gender, Catherine was a perfect role model as a teacher who could defend the old faith against modernism. Surely if she'd been in Cambridge in 1473, she would have defeated the humanism and science which were threatening to undermine the old order and to question the mysterious teachings of theologians. Well, I've now come dangerously close to suggesting that Woodlark's ideals, and even his choice of St Catharine as patron, are the very reverse of everything we now stand for. But St Catharine herself, being a fictional projection of what we want her to be, would have been equal to squaring that circle. Concepts of truth change. Woodlark believed they didn't, but he lacked our advantages. What is regarded as truth has changed as human knowledge has increased, so that we've come to associate it with evidence and reasoning. Even theologians no longer believe that scientific knowledge is incompatible with theology. Indeed, only religious extremists now believe that truth resides exclusively in mystical texts from the ancient world. So I suggest we can reinterpret Woodlark's ideal as being the supreme importance of learning and the defense of truth in the face of ever-present threats in an increasingly post-rational world, which seems to be heading every day towards post-truth. May we hope and pray that the College or Hall of St Catharine will remain, in the words of our charter, a perpetual college and a perpetual fellowship, in fact and in name, of and for a master and 3 or more fellows, incorporated, united, confirmed, and enduring unshakably forever.